On my son's wedding day, my daughter-in-law pushed my wife face first into a mud puddle in front of 200 guests. Then she laughed like it was the best joke of the evening. The white silk dress my wife had spent 3 months choosing ripped open, soaked through, and smeared with dirt. My son stood only a few steps away. He saw everything. Then he turned his back. Nobody apologized. Nobody helped her up. I stood there completely still. And in that moment, I understood something. This wasn't an accident. It was a statement. Before I go further, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. I want to know who these stories are reaching. Now let's return to that moment in the garden after the rain. The place where a so-called slip, one that was anything but random, opened a door I never thought I'd have to walk through. I still remember that moment clearly. Not because of the mud on my wife's dress, but because of the laughter that came right after she fell. 1 second earlier, the garden was still damp from the rain. Cameras were flashing non-stop. People were being posed for the final family photo. 1 second later, everything froze. Helena slipped when someone stomped hard on the hem of her gown from behind. She lost her balance and went straight down into a puddle still holding rainwater. I heard the silk tear. I heard the sharp breath leave her chest as her hand hit the cold ground. Mud splashed up onto the white fabric, spreading fast, as if it had been waiting. Vanessa was standing right behind her. I saw it clearly. She didn't bend down. She didn't reach out a hand. She laughed, a high, cutting laugh. Then she said, loud enough for people nearby to hear, "Oh, please, Mom, don't put on a show to steal my spotlight." The air dropped for a moment. A few people laughed awkwardly. Some looked away. Nobody challenged what she said. And what chilled me most wasn't the words. It was the silence that accepted them. Helena was still on her knees. One hand pressed into the ground, trying to stand, but the wet dress was heavy, pulling her back down. I looked into her eyes. There were no tears, just the stunned look of someone who had just realized she was playing a role she'd never been invited into. Then I looked at Marcus. My son stood a few steps away. He saw everything. He heard every word. Instead of moving forward, he adjusted the cuff of his suit, turned his head, and pretended to listen to the photographer arranging the group. In that instant, I understood this was no longer just a matter between mother-in-law and daughter-in-law. Someone from the bride's side commented that the garden was slippery after the rain, that older people needed to be more careful. Someone else whispered about the photo being ruined. Nobody mentioned the foot on the dress. Nobody repeated the words that had just been said. Everything was covered with smooth, polite remarks, as if refusing to name it could make it disappear. I stepped forward and helped my wife up. Her hand was cold, coated in mud. I brushed at the dress out of habit, knowing there was no way to make it clean again. Helena shook her head slightly, telling me not to say anything. Even then, she was still trying to protect our son's dignity, after hers had just been dragged through the dirt. The cameras started flashing again. Someone said we needed to continue to stay on schedule. Vanessa had already turned away. Her smile was back in place, as if what just happened was nothing more than an extra detail in her perfect script. As I took my assigned spot, a clear contradiction hit me. I was attending a wedding I had quietly paid for, piece by piece. Yet I was being treated like someone who should step aside, out of the frame. Helena was led away to change. The torn dress was folded and placed into a bag like something with no remaining value. I walked beside her, hearing my shoes sink softly into the damp ground. For the first time that day, it no longer felt like a wedding. A thought formed slowly in my mind. No anger, no impulse. If this was how they chose to begin this new relationship, then that fall was not an accident. It was the first sign that a boundary had been crossed. And once that boundary is broken, my silence from that moment on is no longer patience. It is memory. When we returned to the main hall, the smell of hot food and the clinking of glasses drowned out everything else. Nobody mentioned the garden after the rain. Nobody asked if Helena was okay. The story had been closed quickly, as if changing locations was enough to make it disappear. Our seats were at the far end of the hall, right near the kitchen entrance. A small table with a slightly wrinkled tablecloth, separated from the large round tables where Vanessa's family was laughing loudly. I looked around and understood this wasn't accidental. The spot had been chosen carefully, far enough to stay out of the main photos, close enough to be easily ignored. Helena sat down very slowly. She placed her hands on her lap, back straight like she was sitting in an old classroom again. I knew she was trying to act normal, but every movement was more careful than usual. The replacement dress was simpler, not the one she had planned for so long. I looked at her hands. The mud was gone, but the skin was still red. Meanwhile, the head table erupted with laughter. Vanessa was surrounded, receiving compliments non-stop. Her family talked about the wedding like a successful deal. I caught fragments of numbers, handshakes, promises. Nobody said our names. I stood up and told Helena I was going to get some water. The truth was, I needed air. The hallway behind the hall led to a temporary changing area for both families. The door wasn't fully closed. Light spilled out just enough for me to see shadows and hear voices. I wasn't trying to listen, but when I heard my name, I stopped. Vanessa's voice came first, confident, unfiltered. She spoke about the future, about things that would soon belong to Marcus. Then an older man spoke. I assumed it was her father. He mentioned a life insurance policy, spoke about $2 million as if it were obvious, like an account already waiting, just pending the right moment. They talked about property, about transferring names to keep things simple, about business debts that needed quick handling. Every sentence was polite, calm. And underneath it all, I heard anticipation. Then Marcus spoke. His voice was lower, more cautious, but he didn't object. He said I was getting old, that I forgot things, that letting him manage the assets would be safer. He even chuckled like he was telling a harmless story about his parents. I stood there with my hand on the cold doorframe. In that moment, I didn't feel anger. I felt clarity, a kind so sharp there was no room for misunderstanding. Helena's fall in the garden wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of how they saw us. People whose role was over, whose value now existed only on paper. I went back to the table. Helena looked up at me. She searched my face as if asking something. I shook my head slightly. Not yet. I sat down, lifted my glass, and didn't drink. The music grew louder, covering private conversations. On stage, someone spoke about love and unity. I listened and felt nothing. We didn't stay long. I told Helena we should leave early. She didn't ask why. She stood up, put on her coat, and nodded. Nobody noticed us leaving. The hall doors closed behind us, cutting off the music and laughter, leaving a silence that felt real. Outside, the rain had started again. Not enough to call it rain, just enough to dampen our shoulders. We walked slowly through the parking lot. Helena held my hand. This time she held it tight. On the drive home, neither of us spoke. I focused on the road. In my mind, the pieces began to fit together. The seating arrangement, the comment in the garden, the conversation behind the door. All of it pointed to one thing. They had already decided who we were in this story without asking. When we got home, Helena sat down. She spoke softly, almost to herself. She said she was sorry for putting me in an awkward position on our son's wedding day. I looked at her, and in that moment I knew I couldn't stay silent in the same way anymore. I didn't explain what I had heard. Not yet. I only told her that things would become clear, that she didn't need to try to please anyone anymore. She nodded, but I knew she didn't fully understand. Some truths spoken too early only hurt more. That night, I didn't sleep much. I sat at my old desk and opened documents I hadn't touched in years, not to react, but to prepare. I understood that from this moment on, every step had to be precise, quiet, deliberate. Because when people start calculating your future like a number, silence is no longer patience. It becomes time. Time to decide which doors to close and where to keep the key. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. The house was quiet. Only the soft sound of the kettle coming to a boil in the kitchen. Helena was still asleep. I looked at her for a long moment, then gently closed the bedroom door. Some decisions don't need to be spoken right away. They need time to stand on their own. I started by doing nothing at all. I didn't call Marcus. I didn't text Vanessa. I didn't ask about their honeymoon. The silence stretched from one day into the next. I knew they would notice. It was only a matter of time. For people who are used to attention, silence is always the first sign that a door is slowly closing. That week, I cancelled an appointment I had already scheduled with a broker in the city. The apartment I had planned to help Marcus with, the $300,000 I had carefully set aside, was quietly removed from the plan. No drama, no explanation. Just a short final confirmation. I saved a copy and placed it in a separate folder. I called a property appraiser I had worked with many years ago. He came by in the afternoon, walked the land, took careful notes. We spoke very little. I told him to work as he always did. No rush. I didn't explain why. For me, the valuation wasn't about selling. It was about knowing exactly where I stood. Marcus called on the third day. His voice was upbeat, as if nothing had happened. He talked about his busy schedule, about plans ahead. I listened and answered briefly. He mentioned the apartment, said Vanessa was excited. I told him I was reviewing some paperwork and needed more time. On the other end of the line, there was a short pause, just long enough for me to know the message had landed. After that, the calls came more often. Not from Marcus directly, but from Vanessa. Her tone wasn't indirect. She said Helena should come by the new apartment to help organize things, since older people at home don't really have anything to do. I listened without responding. I looked over at my wife, sitting quietly by the window. I told Helena that if she wanted to go, she could. No explanations needed. She looked at me, slightly surprised. I knew she didn't understand why I was letting things unfold this way, but I also knew she needed to see it for herself. In the days that followed, Helena went back and forth between our house and Marcus's apartment. She cleaned, she organized. She listened to cold instructions, casual remarks that sounded harmless but repeated themselves again and again. Each time she came home, she was more tired, more silent. I didn't ask questions. I made tea, left a warm towel ready, and remembered everything. I placed a small recording device in her coat pocket. Not to spy, but to protect. I explained why. Helena didn't object. She just nodded, as if she finally understood that her endurance was now being put to the right use. Meanwhile, I continued preparing. I met with our family lawyer, the man who had worked with me since my working years. We reviewed every agreement. All previous financial support had conditions. Those conditions had been violated, clearly, provably. I didn't need anything more than precision. Marcus called again. This time his voice was lower. He asked if I was okay. I said I was. He mentioned the inheritance paperwork I had once said I was preparing. I replied that everything was under review. I didn't promise. I didn't refuse. That kind of uncertainty tests patience more than any outright no. The recordings began to add up. There was no shouting, no dramatic scenes. Just steady comments, small commands, repeated put-downs. Enough to reveal a pattern, enough to show character. One evening, Helena came home late. She sat down, her hands trembling slightly. She said Vanessa had asked her to mop the floor a third time because it wasn't done right. Marcus had been there. He said nothing. I listened without reacting. I turned off the stove, pulled out a chair for her, and said that starting tomorrow, she wouldn't be going back. She looked at me. This time, she didn't ask why. In her eyes, I saw relief mixed with worry. I took her hand and told her that it was enough now. That night, I organized all the files, every document in its place, every recording backed up. Nothing rushed, nothing emotional. I understood that a climax doesn't come from raised voices, but from the moment someone realizes every choice they made has been carefully recorded. When I closed the final folder, I knew I was ready, not to confront but to end a chapter with clarity. The silence had done its work. What came next I wouldn't need many words for. The housewarming party was held on a weekend evening, exactly the kind Vanessa liked. Warm yellow lights filled the apartment. The music was just loud enough to cover any awkward silence. I knew about the event through an invitation sent to Helena, not to me. That didn't surprise me. I had grown used to being kept out of the frame. We arrived on time. Not early, not late. I wore an old suit, clean and well-fitted. Helena walked beside me, her pace slow, calmer than I expected. When the elevator doors opened, we stepped into a space designed to impress. Familiar faces from the upper circles stood in small groups, glasses in hand, polite smiles in place. Nobody noticed us right away. Marcus was near the large window, talking with a few men I assumed were business partners. Vanessa moved between groups, her voice clear and confident, like this was her personal stage. When she saw Helena, she gave a brief nod, then turned away. I hadn't expected anything else. We stayed near the edge of the room. I let things unfold a little longer. There was no need to rush. People boast more freely when they believe they're safe. I heard Vanessa talk about the apartment as a finished achievement. She mentioned family support, speaking as if everything had already been signed and transferred, neatly wrapped up. Then the doorbell rang. A small sound, but enough to break the rhythm. Vanessa frowned and motioned for the assistant to open the door. When it did, two well-dressed men stepped inside, followed by a woman holding a folder. They introduced themselves briefly. I saw Vanessa pause, her smile slowing by a beat. I took one step forward. No raised voice, no dramatic gesture. I simply stood where I needed to be. I said they were there at my request. The room grew quiet, one group at a time, turning toward us, attention settling into a single point. The woman opened the folder. She clearly stated the purpose of their visit, to formally announce the cancellation of the apartment purchase under the activated clauses. The property was no longer classified as personal support. It had been legally transferred into a charitable trust for abandoned elderly individuals, per the decision of the original benefactor. Vanessa reacted first. She spoke quickly, her voice sharp, asking about rights, about agreements. The woman responded calmly, point by point. Everything was documented. Signatures, dates, conditions. There was no space left for emotional argument. Marcus turned to me. His expression shifted between confusion and anger. He asked why I would do this here of all places. I looked at him for the first time that evening. I said, because this was where everyone believed everything was already settled. And because the truth, if it must be spoken, should be spoken where it was once hidden. Vanessa stepped forward, her voice trembling, though she tried to stay in control. She said I was humiliating them in front of their guests. I didn't answer right away. I simply signaled to the lawyer standing beside me. He played a short recording, not long. No editing needed. The footage showed Helena falling into the mud in the garden. The laughter. The sentence I had heard so clearly that day. The music stopped. Nobody spoke. The looks in the room began to change, no longer curious but calculating. I spoke slowly so everyone could hear. I said my money could fund parties, apartments, and beautiful photographs. But it could not buy respect for those who didn't understand its value. And that was why I had chosen to place it somewhere it would not be treated as an entitlement. Vanessa stepped back, her face pale. Marcus stood frozen, unable to speak. I didn't need to see more. I turned to Helena. She stood straight, meeting every gaze without flinching. I took her hand. That was signal enough. We left before anyone could ask a question. The elevator doors closed, cutting off the whispers behind us. In that narrow space, I could hear my own breathing. Not fast, not strained, just light. Outside, the night air was cooler than I expected. Helena said she felt fine. I nodded. No more words were needed. What had to be revealed was revealed. The rest I didn't need to witness. I knew from that moment on nothing would be the same. But I also knew I had closed a door at the right time. And when a door is closed with clarity, no one has the right to knock again. After that evening, I never returned to that apartment. I didn't wait for any explanations either. Some things, once spoken in the open, no longer need to be managed. The rest unfolds on its own. Marcus called me a few times in the following week. The first time his voice was rushed. He talked about misunderstandings, about pressure, about how things had gone too far. I listened without interrupting. When he stopped, I told him I had heard enough. I didn't accuse him. I only said that the choices he made were not the result of a single day. And because of that, they couldn't be erased by a single phone call. Vanessa's family reacted faster. They didn't call me. They called my lawyer. They asked about reversing things, about alternative arrangements. The answers were the same every time. The clauses had been legally activated. There was nothing to negotiate. When the money was no longer where they expected it to be, their interest faded quickly. I heard that Marcus was placed in an uncomfortable position at work. Nobody said it outright, but whispers about ethics and reputation began to circulate. I didn't feel pleased. I didn't feel sad either. I understood that the consequences weren't something I created. I had simply stopped shielding him. As for Vanessa, the expenses for the wedding and the apartment didn't disappear with the party. The bills returned to the names that had signed them. No shouting ever reached me, just a long stretch of silence. And then nothing. Helena and I sold the old house toward the end of summer. Not because we needed the money, but because we no longer needed to hold on to rooms full of memories we had never truly lived for ourselves. We kept what mattered. The rest stayed with the new owners. The move was slow, unhurried. Our first trip was to a place Helena had mentioned long ago, but always postponed. A distant coast. Gentle sunlight. No schedule. We woke up late, walked slowly, ate simple meals. Nobody knew who we were. Nobody needed to. One afternoon, we sat watching the calm water. Helena said she felt like she had just stepped out of a narrow room she hadn't realized she was trapped in. I held her hand. I didn't say anything. Some things only need to be allowed to exist in that moment. I received a message from Marcus a few months later. No request for money. No ask for help. Just a short line saying he understood. I read it, set the phone down, and didn't reply right away. Not out of anger, but because some distances need time before they can be measured again. We kept traveling. One place at a time, one day at its own pace. Helena smiled more. She still walked slowly, but her eyes no longer avoided anything. I realized that for many years we had lived so fully for responsibility that we forgot how to live for ourselves. One evening, sitting outside with a soft breeze, I told her that maybe we had tried to nurture a tree that never bore fruit for far too long. Helena looked at me and nodded. She said, "Not every letting go is a failure. Sometimes it's the only way to preserve what's still whole." I thought about everything that had happened. There was no sense of victory, only clarity. I understood that devotion cannot be bought and apparent silence is not weakness. It is the final patience before we choose to stand on our own side. As the sun went down, Helena and I sat closer together. We didn't talk about the past. We didn't predict the future. We were simply there together. And in that moment, I knew the door that had closed behind us wasn't meant to lock anyone out. It was meant to open another path. A quieter one, fitting for the life we still deserve to live. Thank you for staying with me until the final moments of this story. I didn't share it to blame or accuse anyone, but to remind us that in every family, respect must come before any benefit. Parents don't need to be worshipped, but they should never be treated as something taken for granted. This story only finds its full meaning if it reaches someone who is silently enduring, or someone who may be unknowingly hurting those closest to them. If you feel that connection, please like the video to support the channel. Subscribe for more stories like this, and share it with anyone you believe needs to hear it. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. And remember this, when parents choose silence, it is not weakness. It is the final boundary before they are forced to stand up for themselves.